I hadn't driven through Napa Valley in 4 years. The rolling hills still looked picture perfect, draped in late summer vines heavy with grapes ready for harvest. But as I pulled my rental car through the iron gates of Grandview Estate winery, nothing felt welcoming. The GPS had guided me here like it was just another destination. But this wasn't just another place. This was my sister Rachel's wedding venue, and according to the engraved invitation I never received, I wasn't supposed to be here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The last time I saw my family, I was 22 and naive enough to think they'd understand why I chose the Navy over the family real estate empire. 4 years of silence later, I learned about Rachel's engagement through a Facebook post that somehow made it past their careful social media curation. The wedding announcement in the Napa Valley Register mentioned the Rodriguez family's joy and listed the wedding party. My name appeared nowhere, not even in the family acknowledgments. It was like I'd been surgically removed from their story, clean and complete. The valet at Grandview Estate looked at my government-issued rental sedan, like it had personally offended him. I stepped out wearing a simple navy blue dress, the kind you could find at any department store. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed, "Look at me." The kind of outfit that would blend into the background, which seemed appropriate since I was apparently background material in my own family's narrative. The valet took my keys with the expression of someone handling evidence from a crime scene, probably wondering how someone driving economy transportation had made it past security. Inside, Grandview Estate was everything you'd expect from a venue that charged more per hour than most people made in a month. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed wooden beams, creating an atmosphere that whispered old money and new pretensions. The main reception hall buzzed with the controlled energy of 200 guests who all seemed to know exactly where they belonged. I could hear champagne glasses clinking, and the particular kind of laughter that wealthy people make when they're performing happiness for each other. The wedding coordinator, a woman with a clipboard and the nervous energy of someone managing other people's money, spotted me immediately. She approached with a smile that looked practiced and slightly concerned, like she was greeting someone who might be lost. "Are you here for the Rodriguez-Wellington wedding?" she asked, consulting her list with the efficiency of someone who'd memorized every approved guest. When I nodded, she frowned slightly and flipped through several pages. "I don't see your name on the main reception list. Let me check with the family liaison." She disappeared for several minutes, leaving me standing in the foyer while wedding guests flowed around me like water around a stone. I recognized some faces from the old days, family friends and business associates who'd known me since childhood. A few glanced my way with expressions that suggested they almost recognized me but couldn't quite place where they knew me from. It was remarkable how quickly you could become invisible to people who used to ask about your report cards and college plans. The coordinator returned with a different expression, one that suggested she'd received very specific instructions. "We've arranged seating for you in the staff area," she said carefully, as if the words themselves might explode if spoken too loudly. "It's much quieter there, and you'll have a lovely view of the vineyard." The staff area. Not the overflow seating, not a table in the back, but literally where the catering team took their breaks between courses. It was such a precise insult that I almost admired its creativity. I followed her through a side corridor that clearly wasn't meant for guests, past industrial kitchens, where servers rushed between prep stations, and into a small break room with folding chairs and a view of the parking area where delivery trucks unloaded linens and flowers. A card table had been set up with a single-place setting, complete with a wilted centerpiece that looked like it had been rescued from a practice arrangement. "The staff will make sure you have everything you need," the coordinator said before escaping back to her legitimate responsibilities. So there I sat, in a room that smelled like industrial coffee and kitchen grease, listening to my sister's wedding reception through the walls. I could hear the band starting up, something classical and expensive that would photograph well for the society pages. Through the small window, I watched guests moving between the ceremony space and the reception hall, all of them belonging somewhere I apparently didn't. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in a service area. considering what my family thought of my choice to serve my country instead of serving their business interests. My phone buzzed against the table, and I glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls from my executive assistant, 2 from the Pentagon Liaison Office, and 1 marked urgent from the Seattle Operations Center. I'd told my team I was taking personal time, but apparently the world didn't pause for family drama. The latest message was time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Admiral Morrison requesting immediate callback. Singapore contract requires authorization before Monday market open. Fleet movement pending your approval. I set the phone face down and listened to the sounds of celebration bleeding through the walls. Rachel's voice carried over the music, bright and happy, thanking everyone for being part of their special day. "We're so grateful to be surrounded by the people who matter most," she was saying, and I wondered if anyone else noticed the careful phrasing. Not everyone who mattered, just the people who mattered most. It was the kind of linguistic precision that left room for strategic omissions. The door opened, and a catering server entered, looking surprised to find someone in their break space. She was young, probably working her way through college, and she offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was using this room. Do you need anything? Water, coffee?" Her kindness was genuine, which made it the first authentic interaction I'd had since arriving. I thanked her and declined, watching her gather supplies for the next course service. At least someone was treating me like a human being, even if it was by accident. The server had barely left when the break room door swung open again, this time revealing my brother Tyler. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the folding chairs and industrial lighting like he was surveying a disaster zone. Tyler had always been good at making entrances, even into rooms that weren't meant for them. At 28, he'd perfected the art of looking successful without actually accomplishing much beyond inheriting the right last name. His charcoal gray suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his watch caught the fluorescent light in a way that seemed intentional. "Emma," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. His voice carried that particular tone he'd developed over the years, the one that managed to sound both surprised and disappointed simultaneously. "I heard you were here. Didn't think you'd actually show up." He glanced around the break room with obvious distaste, as if the mere act of being in a service area might somehow contaminate his expensive clothing. "Though I guess this explains why nobody saw you during the ceremony." I stayed seated at the card table, not bothering to stand or offer any of the social pleasantries that normal siblings might exchange after 4 years of separation. "Hello, Tyler. You look exactly the same." It wasn't meant as a compliment, and from his expression, he understood that perfectly. He'd always been sensitive about being told he looked the same, probably because it implied a lack of growth or development. In his case, it was particularly accurate. He moved closer to the table, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "You know, when Rachel told us you might come, we all thought she was being optimistic. After 4 years of radio silence, most of us figured you'd moved on completely." Tyler had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a business negotiation, even family conversations. It was probably useful in his role managing Rodriguez's commercial properties, though I suspected most of his success came from inheriting clients rather than earning them. "I wouldn't want to miss Rachel's big day," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Though it seems like missing it was the original plan." Tyler shifted uncomfortably, apparently not expecting me to address the obvious snub directly. He'd always preferred conversations where everyone pretended not to notice the uncomfortable truths hanging in the air like smoke. "Look, Emma, you have to understand the position we're in here. This is a significant social event. Rachel and Marcus have invited some very important people. Business leaders, political figures, people who matter in this community." Tyler pulled out one of the folding chairs and sat down across from me, though he perched on the edge like he might need to escape quickly. "Your whole military thing, it just doesn't fit the image we're trying to project." My whole military thing. 4 years of naval intelligence service reduced to a hobby that embarrassed the family brand. I wondered if Tyler had any idea what my military thing actually involved, or if he'd simply categorized it as something vaguely patriotic but socially inconvenient. "What image is that exactly?" I asked. "Success, stability, the kind of values that build lasting businesses and strong communities." Tyler leaned forward slightly, adopting what I recognized as his client presentation posture. Dad's been working for 20 years to establish Rodriguez Commercial Properties as the premier development firm in Northern California. We've got projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, partnerships with major tech companies looking to expand into wine country. This wedding isn't just about Rachel. It's about demonstrating that our family represents the kind of people these companies want to work with. I nodded slowly, pretending to consider his explanation. And having a sister in the Navy somehow undermines that message. It's not about undermining anything, Tyler said quickly, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. It's about consistency. When potential clients look at our family, they see Rachel building her marketing consultancy. They see me expanding the commercial division. They see a cohesive vision of entrepreneurial success. Adding military service to that narrative just creates confusion about who we are and what we represent. The break room door opened again, and the young server returned, this time carrying a tray of champagne glasses. She looked between Tyler and me, clearly sensing the tension but professional enough not to comment. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I just need to grab some cocktail napkins." Tyler watched her with the expression of someone observing an entirely different species, apparently fascinated by the concept of people who worked for hourly wages. After she left, Tyler continued his explanation. "The thing is, Emma, perception matters in our business. When we're competing for a $50 million development contract, the client wants to know they're working with people who understand their world, their priorities, their definition of success. Military service is admirable, sure, but it signals a different set of values, a different approach to problem solving. It suggests someone who follows orders rather than creates vision." I almost laughed at that assessment, considering that my current position involved making decisions that affected international maritime operations worth billions of dollars. But Tyler's worldview had always been remarkably narrow, shaped by country club conversations and business magazines that reinforced his existing assumptions about success and significance. So the solution was to pretend I don't exist? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The solution was to focus on the message that serves everyone's interests, Tyler replied. Rachel gets her perfect wedding without complications. Mom and Dad get to present a unified family image to their business associates, and honestly, you probably prefer it this way. I can't imagine you'd enjoy making small talk with a bunch of real estate developers and tech executives. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen. Another message from the operations center, this one marked priority. Tyler noticed my attention shift and looked irritated, as if checking my phone was somehow disrespectful during his lecture about family loyalty and business priorities. "Still busy saving the world?" he asked with barely concealed sarcasm. "Something like that," I replied, setting the phone face down again. Tyler had no idea how accurate his sarcastic comment actually was, though I doubted he'd appreciate the irony if I explained it. His understanding of global affairs probably extended to whatever international markets affected wine country real estate values. "You know what I don't understand?" Tyler leaned back in his chair, apparently settling in for a longer conversation. "Why you chose the Navy in the first place. Dad offered you a position with the company, a real career with real growth potential. Instead, you walked away from everything we'd built as a family to go play sailor for the government. It never made sense to any of us." Play sailor. I wondered what Tyler would think if he knew that his dismissive characterization of my service had just described someone who currently held operational authority over Pacific Fleet logistics coordination. "Maybe I wanted to accomplish something on my own merit instead of inheriting it," I said. "Inherit it?" Tyler's voice rose slightly, though he caught himself and lowered it again, mindful of the wedding celebration continuing just beyond the walls. "Nobody inherits anything in this family without earning it. I've been working my ass off for 6 years to build the commercial division. Rachel started her own consultancy from scratch. We've all contributed to what this family has accomplished." I studied Tyler's face, genuinely curious about whether he believed his own revisionist history. "You started working for Dad's company straight out of college, using his client relationships and his reputation to generate business. Rachel's consultancy landed its first 3 major contracts through Dad's business connections. But sure, you both built everything from scratch." Tyler's jaw tightened, a familiar sign that he was running out of reasonable arguments and preparing to shift into defensive mode. At least we stayed and contributed instead of running away to join the military, because we couldn't handle the pressure of real responsibility. Real responsibility, I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air between us. Tyler had always been skilled at reframing narratives to position himself as the reasonable party, but his definition of real responsibility apparently excluded serving your country in favor of managing inherited commercial real estate projects in wine country. Yes, real responsibility. Making payroll, managing client relationships, dealing with regulatory challenges, building something that lasts. Tyler was warming to his theme now, probably repeating arguments he'd made to justify his position to himself over the years. The military is all about following protocols and taking orders. Business requires actual leadership, real decision-making under pressure. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his perspective for the first time. You're right, Tyler. Following protocols and taking orders. That's definitely all the Navy involves. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Admiral Morrison's office. I let it go to voicemail, making a mental note to return it before the Pacific Fleet's operational window closed. I'm not trying to be insulting, Tyler said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm just saying that some of us chose to build something permanent, something that creates value for our community and provides for our families. Military service is temporary. What are you going to do when your enlistment ends? Come back here and ask Dad for a job? The irony of Tyler's question was so profound that I had to resist the urge to smile. He was sitting in a catering break room, explaining to his sister why she didn't belong at a family wedding, while completely unaware that she currently controlled maritime operations that his family's business depended on for their overseas supplier relationships. I'll figure something out, I said. The break room door opened with more authority this time, and my mother Patricia swept in, wearing a champagne-colored silk dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She moved with the calculated grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making an entrance, even into spaces as humble as a catering break room. Her diamond jewelry caught the harsh fluorescent lighting, creating small rainbows on the industrial walls that seemed wildly out of place in the utilitarian space. "Tyler, there you are," she said, completely ignoring my presence as if I were part of the room's furniture. "The Wellingtons are asking about the property development timeline, and your father needs you to handle the conversation properly." Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that managed to convey disappointment and expectation simultaneously. Patricia Rodriguez had built her identity around managing her family's public image, like a carefully curated art exhibition. Tyler stood immediately, straightening his tie in a gesture that had become automatic whenever our mother appeared. "Of course, Mom. I was just finishing up here." He glanced at me briefly as if trying to decide whether acknowledging my existence would complicate his escape from this conversation. "We can continue this later, Emma." "Actually, Tyler, you can go handle the Wellingtons," Patricia said, finally turning her attention to me with the expression of someone discovering an unexpected stain on expensive fabric. "I need to have a word with your sister." The way she said your sister made it clear that family relationships were currently being distributed selectively, and mine was apparently on probationary status. Tyler left quickly, clearly relieved to escape whatever conversation was about to unfold. Patricia waited until the door closed completely, before settling into the folding chair Tyler had vacated, though she perched on it like she was posing for a photographer who specialized in capturing dignity under adverse circumstances. "Emma, darling," she began, and I knew immediately that the endearment was a weapon, not an affection. "Hello, Mother." I kept my voice neutral, having learned years ago that emotional reactions only provided her with additional ammunition for whatever argument she was preparing to make. Patricia had always been skilled at turning other people's feelings into evidence of their inadequacy. "I have to say, I'm surprised you decided to come today. When Rachel mentioned she'd reached out to you, we all thought it was just wishful thinking." Patricia smoothed her dress unnecessarily, a nervous habit she'd developed that somehow managed to look elegant rather than anxious. "Though I suppose it's natural that you'd want to be part of such an important family milestone." It seemed like the right thing to do, I replied, watching her carefully. Patricia's conversations always contained multiple layers of meaning, and missing the subtext could be dangerous. She had a talent for making statements that sounded supportive on the surface, while carrying entirely different messages underneath. Of course, though I do wish you'd given us more notice. Coordinating an event of this magnitude requires careful planning, and last-minute additions can create complications. Patricia glanced around the break room with barely concealed distaste. I hope you understand that the seating arrangements were finalized weeks ago. The main reception area is quite full, and we wanted to ensure everyone was comfortable. The main reception area was quite full. It was such a perfectly constructed excuse that I almost admired its efficiency. Patricia had managed to frame my exile to the service area as a thoughtful accommodation rather than a deliberate snub. The view from here is fine, I said, gesturing toward the window that overlooked the parking area where catering trucks were being unloaded. I'm glad you're comfortable. Patricia's smile was the kind she reserved for situations where she needed to appear gracious while delivering unwelcome news. You know, Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation 4 years ago, before you left for the Navy. You were so determined to prove something, so convinced that military service would provide you with some kind of fulfillment that you couldn't find here with your family. She paused, apparently waiting for me to respond, but I remained silent. Patricia's reminiscences were rarely nostalgic, more often serving as setups for points she wanted to make about present circumstances. I remember telling you then that independence is admirable, but isolation is just sad. A person needs community, needs connections to people who share their values and understand their goals. I have connections, I said simply, thinking about the team of analysts and operations specialists who reported to me daily, the network of international contacts who trusted my judgment on matters that affected global commerce, the Pentagon liaisons who called me directly when situations required immediate attention. But Patricia's definition of meaningful connections was considerably more narrow. I'm sure you've made friends, she said, with the tone of someone discussing a child's imaginary companions. But friendship isn't the same as belonging somewhere that matters. When your military service ends, you'll need to build a real life, and that requires more than just good intentions and patriotic feelings. My phone buzzed again, and this time I couldn't ignore it. The message was from Commander Chen, marked urgent and requiring immediate response. Patricia noticed my attention shift, and her expression tightened with the particular irritation she reserved for people who didn't prioritize her conversations appropriately. Is that really necessary right now? She asked. Work doesn't pause for family events, I replied, quickly scanning the message. Another maritime logistics crisis that required authorization from someone with my clearance level. I typed a brief response approving the recommended course of action, then set the phone aside again. Work, Patricia repeated, as if the concept required careful consideration. You know, darling, when you first announced your intention to join the Navy, your father and I researched what that would actually mean. Military salaries, even for officers, are quite modest compared to civilian opportunities. The lifestyle is inherently unstable, moving from base to base, never really establishing roots anywhere. And the social connections are limited to other military personnel, which creates a rather narrow worldview. She was building toward something, I could tell. Patricia never delivered casual observations, especially not about topics she'd obviously researched and prepared to discuss. Your father has been following your career through his business contacts who work with defense contractors. He knows you've been stationed at several different bases, that you've been deployed overseas multiple times. It sounds exhausting, and frankly, it sounds lonely. I'm not lonely, I said, though I wondered what Patricia would consider an acceptable level of social connection. Her own social circle consisted primarily of other wealthy wives who competed over charity board positions and vacation destinations, hardly a model of meaningful human connection. Perhaps not lonely in the obvious sense, Patricia conceded, but certainly isolated from the kind of relationships that provide real security and stability. Look at Rachel today, surrounded by friends she's maintained since college, marrying into a family that understands her background and values. Look at Tyler, building a career that connects him to his community and creates lasting value for people he cares about. I glanced toward the window, where catering staff were wheeling equipment between trucks and the main building. The wedding celebration continued beyond the walls. a carefully orchestrated performance of happiness and success that would be photographed extensively and shared across social media platforms to demonstrate the Rodriguez family's continued prominence in wine country society. And you think I'm missing out on that? I think you're choosing difficulty over belonging, Patricia said, leaning forward slightly. Military service is admirable, Emma, but it's also temporary. Eventually, you'll want stability, you'll want to be part of something permanent and meaningful. When that time comes, your family will be here, and Rodriguez Commercial Properties will have opportunities for someone with your intelligence and work ethic. The offer was delivered casually, almost as an afterthought, but I recognized it as the central purpose of this conversation. Patricia had come to the break room not to welcome me back or express maternal affection, but to recruit me for the family business using a combination of emotional manipulation and practical necessity. Dad's been talking about expansion into government contracting, she continued. Your military background could be quite valuable in that context. My military background. 4 years of naval intelligence work reduced to a credential that might help Rodriguez Commercial Properties win a few government contracts. Patricia's worldview was so narrow that she couldn't conceive of military service as anything more than an extended networking opportunity. That's an interesting idea, I said noncommittally. It would also solve the current situation, Patricia added, apparently emboldened by my neutral response. Having a daughter in the military creates certain social complications, as I'm sure you've noticed today. But having a daughter who leveraged her military experience to build a successful civilian career, that's a narrative that works much better for everyone involved. The social complications she was referring to were sitting in a catering break room instead of celebrating with the rest of the family. But Patricia had managed to frame my exclusion as evidence of broader social challenges rather than specific family choices. You've thought this through, I observed. Your father and I care about your future, Emma. We want you to succeed, but we also want you to succeed in a way that brings the family together, rather than creating divisions. Patricia stood up gracefully, smoothing her dress again. Think about it. Rachel's wedding represents what's possible when family members support each other's goals and work together toward common objectives. You could be part of that, but it requires choosing connection over isolation. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. The reception will continue for several more hours. If you change your mind about joining the celebration, I'm sure we could find you a place at one of the tables. Not at the head table, obviously, since those arrangements are quite fixed, but somewhere appropriate. The offer was delivered with the tone of someone extending charity to the deserving poor, generous but carefully limited. After Patricia left, I sat alone in the break room, listening to the sounds of the wedding reception filtering through the walls. The band had shifted to something more contemporary, probably to accommodate dancing, and I could hear the rhythmic sound of celebration continuing without any awareness of my presence or absence. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Admiral Morrison himself rather than his staff. Admiral, I answered on the second ring, grateful for the excuse to focus on something concrete rather than Patricia's carefully constructed recruitment pitch. Rodriguez, I need an immediate status update on the Singapore operation. The State Department is asking questions, and I need to brief the secretary within the hour. Admiral Morrison's voice was crisp and direct, the kind of communication I'd grown accustomed to in my current position. No emotional manipulation, no hidden agendas, just clear requests for specific information. All contracts are executing on schedule, sir. The Maritime Logistics Corridor is functioning at 94% efficiency, and our vendor relationships are stable. The political situation hasn't affected operational capabilities. I delivered the report concisely, thinking about how different this conversation felt compared to the family interactions I'd been navigating all day. Excellent. What about the expansion timeline? Are we still looking at full implementation by October? Admiral Morrison was asking about a project that would affect international shipping routes and potentially influence trade relationships worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It was the kind of responsibility that Patricia couldn't conceive of when she talked about my modest military salary and limited career prospects. Ahead of schedule, actually. We should have Phase 2 operational by September 15th, assuming no political complications. I glanced toward the window where wedding guests were beginning to move outside for what looked like a ceremonial champagne toast. Rachel appeared in her elaborate white dress, Marcus beside her in his custom tuxedo, both of them glowing with the particular happiness that comes from having everything go exactly according to plan. Outstanding work, Rodriguez. The Pentagon is very pleased with your results. We'll need a full briefing when you return, but for now, enjoy your leave time. Admiral Morrison ended the call with the efficiency that characterized all his communications, leaving me alone again in the break room, with the sounds of family celebration continuing beyond the walls. I sat back in the folding chair and considered Patricia's offer to find me an appropriate place at one of the reception tables. Somewhere appropriate, meaning somewhere that wouldn't interfere with the carefully constructed seating arrangements that reflected the family's current social and business priorities. The kindness of being included, but only within carefully defined limits. The break room door swung open with enough force to rattle the hinges, and Rachel herself appeared in the doorway like a vision from a bridal magazine. Her wedding dress was everything you'd expect from someone marrying into the Wellington family fortune, layers of imported silk and hand-beaded lace that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. The train swept behind her as she entered, requiring careful navigation around the industrial furniture that clearly wasn't designed for couture gowns. "Emma," she breathed, and for a moment her face showed genuine surprise, as if she'd heard rumors of my presence, but hadn't quite believed them until now. Rachel had always been beautiful, but today she looked like someone had airbrushed her into perfection. Her makeup was flawless, her hair arranged in an elaborate updo that had probably required 3 hours and a team of professionals. She looked like exactly what she was, the star of a very expensive production. "Hello, Rachel, you look beautiful." I meant it, despite everything. Whatever complicated emotions existed between us, she was genuinely radiant in the way that brides are supposed to be on their wedding day. "Congratulations on the marriage. Marcus seems like a good match for you." Rachel closed the door behind her and leaned against it, as if she needed the support or wanted to prevent anyone else from entering. "I can't believe you actually came. When I sent that message through Tyler's assistant, I honestly didn't think you'd respond. It's been 4 years, Emma, 4 years of nothing." "You could have called directly," I pointed out, though we both knew that direct communication had never been Rachel's preferred approach to difficult conversations. She'd always worked through intermediaries when emotions might be involved, whether that was Tyler, our parents, or apparently Tyler's assistant when she wanted to reach out to her estranged sister. "I could have, but I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me after everything that happened when you left." Rachel moved carefully across the small space, her dress requiring constant attention to prevent it from catching on chairs or scraping against the walls. "You were so angry back then, so determined to prove that you didn't need any of us. I thought maybe you'd decided we were all terrible people and wanted nothing to do with the family." I considered her assessment of my departure 4 years earlier. "I wasn't angry at you specifically, Rachel. I was frustrated with the situation, with feeling like I had to choose between serving my country and maintaining my family relationships. It was a simplified version of the truth, but explaining the full complexity of my decision would require more time and emotional energy than this conversation warranted." "But you did choose," Rachel said quietly, settling into one of the folding chairs with the careful movements of someone wearing a dress that costs more than a car. "You chose the Navy over us. You left for basic training without even saying goodbye properly. And then you just disappeared. No calls, no visits, no updates about your life. Mom and Dad didn't even know where you were stationed most of the time." "They didn't ask," I replied. "When I called home after graduation from officer training, Dad spent 5 minutes telling me about a zoning permit dispute, and then handed the phone to Mom, who wanted to know if I was dating anyone appropriate. Nobody asked about my actual work or whether I was enjoying my service." Rachel's expression shifted slightly, the kind of micro-change that suggested she was accessing memories she'd either forgotten or chosen not to examine too closely. They were probably just trying to keep things normal, to talk about familiar topics instead of dwelling on the fact that you'd chosen such a different path. They were trying to ignore the fact that I'd chosen a different path, I corrected. "There's a difference between maintaining normalcy and pretending that inconvenient realities don't exist." My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it, not wanting to give Rachel another reason to feel like I was prioritizing work over family time. "Maybe you're right," Rachel admitted, adjusting her dress carefully. but you have to understand their perspective too. Dad built Rodriguez commercial properties from nothing, and he always assumed his children would be part of that legacy. When you chose military service instead, it felt like a rejection of everything he'd worked to create. Did it occur to anyone that I might have wanted to create my own legacy instead of inheriting one? I asked. Rachel looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if the concept of building something independent from the family business had never seriously crossed her mind. I suppose, but why start from scratch when you could build on what already exists? Dad would have given you significant responsibility in the company, probably your own division to manage. You could have made your mark while still being part of the family enterprise. Rachel spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned the fundamental assumption that success meant building on inherited advantages, rather than creating them independently. And what happens when family loyalty conflicts with business judgment? When being a good daughter means making decisions that aren't necessarily good business? I'd seen enough family businesses implode over exactly those kinds of conflicts to know that mixing blood relations with professional relationships created complications that most people preferred not to acknowledge until they became unavoidable. Rachel waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that managed to be elegant despite the circumstances. Those kinds of conflicts are rare if everyone's committed to the same goals. Look at Tyler's success with the commercial division, or my marketing consultancy. We've all found ways to contribute while maintaining our individual identities. I almost pointed out that Tyler's success depended entirely on inherited client relationships, and that Rachel's consultancy had landed its first major contracts through family connections, but criticizing the bride on her wedding day seemed unnecessarily cruel. You've both done well, I said instead, which was true enough if you didn't examine the foundation too closely. We have, and you could too if you decided to come back after your military service ends. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she'd perfected during her marketing career. Emma, you're brilliant, you're hardworking, and you have experience that could be incredibly valuable in the right context. Dad's been talking about expanding into government contracting, and your military background would give us credibility in that space. It was essentially the same offer Patricia had made, presented with more emotional appeal and less obvious manipulation. Rachel had always been better at sales than our mother, more skilled at making her pitches feel like genuine opportunities rather than calculated recruitment attempts. You've discussed this with Dad? We've all discussed it, Rachel admitted. Not in any formal way, but the topic comes up sometimes. How to bring you back into the family. How to repair the relationships that got damaged when you left. Everyone wants you to be part of our lives again, Emma, but it has to be on terms that work for everyone involved. Terms that work for everyone involved, I repeated, testing the phrase. What would those terms look like exactly? Rachel's offer was more sophisticated than I'd expected, suggesting that the family had indeed given serious thought to the possibility of my return, rather than simply hoping I'd disappear permanently. Well, obviously you'd need to finish your military commitment first. Dad respects that kind of obligation, and breaking a contract would send the wrong message about your character. Rachel was thinking through the logistics as she spoke, probably drawing on conversations she'd had with our parents about the theoretical conditions for my reintegration into family life. After that, you'd have a significant role in whatever direction the company takes. Not entry level, not just because you're family, but based on the skills and experience you've developed during your service. Dad's been researching the defense contracting space, and there are real opportunities for companies with the right connections and expertise. My phone buzzed insistently, and this time I had to glance at it. Another priority message from the operations center, followed immediately by a second call from Admiral Morrison's office. Rachel noticed my distraction and frowned slightly, apparently interpreting my divided attention as evidence that I wasn't taking her offer seriously. "Is that really urgent?" she asked, echoing Patricia's earlier irritation about my work responsibilities intruding on family time. "It's my wedding day, Emma. I was hoping we could have one conversation that didn't involve your phone." "Work doesn't pause for personal events," I said, repeating what I'd told our mother earlier. "But you're right. Today should be about celebrating your marriage." I silenced the phone completely, though I made a mental note to return the calls as soon as this conversation ended. Thank you, Rachel said, relaxing slightly. Look, I know this is all complicated, and I'm not expecting you to make any decisions today. But I want you to know that the door is open, that we want you to be part of the family again, not just as someone who shows up for holidays and weddings, but as someone who contributes to what we're building together. She stood up carefully, managing her dress with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent considerable time rehearsing movements in formal wear. I should get back to the reception before people start wondering where the bride disappeared to. But Emma, promise me you'll think about what I've said. Think about coming home properly, instead of just visiting occasionally when someone gets married or dies. I'll think about it, I promised, which was true even though my thinking would probably reach different conclusions than Rachel hoped. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle, apparently reconsidering something. You know, there's still time to join the reception properly. I could have the coordinator add a place setting at one of the tables, maybe with some of our college friends who knew you before you left. It wouldn't be weird, just a sister celebrating with her family on an important day. The offer was genuine, I could tell, motivated by actual affection, rather than the calculated family politics that had shaped most of my interactions today. Rachel had always been the least complicated member of our family, more interested in harmony than hierarchy, more concerned with inclusion than image management. That's kind of you, but I'm fine here. I don't want to complicate your day or create awkward conversations with guests who weren't expecting to see me. Are you sure? The dinner service is about to start, and the band is incredible. Marcus's family flew them in from New York specifically for tonight. Rachel was genuinely disappointed, I realized, not just making a polite gesture but actually hoping I'd join the celebration properly. I'm sure, I said gently, but I appreciate the invitation. Go enjoy your party, Rachel. You've worked hard to make this day perfect, and you deserve to celebrate without worrying about family complications. Rachel nodded reluctantly, then smiled with the kind of warmth that had always made her popular in school and successful in her marketing career. Okay, but if you change your mind, just find me or the coordinator. We can make it work. She opened the door, then looked back one more time. I'm really glad you came, Emma, even if the circumstances are strange. It means a lot to me that you're here. After she left, I sat alone in the break room for several minutes, processing the conversation and the various offers I'd received throughout the day. My family wanted me back, but only on their terms, only in ways that enhanced, rather than complicated, their existing narrative about success and belonging. They'd constructed a pathway for my return that would minimize disruption to their established order, while maximizing the value of my military experience for their business purposes. My phone had accumulated several more messages during my conversation with Rachel, including 2 marked urgent and 1 from a Pentagon number I recognized as belonging to the Deputy Secretary's office. I unlocked the screen and began working through the backlog, grateful for the excuse to focus on clear, concrete problems that had definitive solutions, rather than the emotional complexity of family relationships that seemed to resist all attempts at resolution. My father David arrived in the break room with the measured steps of someone who had mentally rehearsed this conversation multiple times. He wore his formal navy suit, the one reserved for board meetings and significant social events, with a silver tie that matched his graying temples perfectly. At 55, David Rodriguez carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built something substantial from modest beginnings, though his current expression suggested uncertainty about how to handle his youngest daughter's unexpected appearance at what was supposed to be a carefully orchestrated family celebration. Emma, he said, closing the door behind him with deliberate care, I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk today. His voice carried the same authoritative tone he used in business meetings, though I detected an underlying tension that suggested this conversation would be more challenging than negotiating commercial real estate contracts with difficult clients. Hello, Dad. I remained seated at the folding table, not bothering with the social pleasantries that might normally accompany a reunion after 4 years of minimal contact. David had always appreciated directness in business contexts, and our current situation seemed to call for the same approach. He pulled out the chair Rachel had vacated and sat down with the careful posture of someone conducting an important negotiation. Your mother tells me you've been having conversations with Tyler and Rachel about your future plans. I thought it might be helpful if we discussed those possibilities directly, without intermediaries or assumptions about what anyone wants or expects. David's approach was characteristically methodical, establishing parameters for our discussion while positioning himself as the reasonable party seeking clarity rather than conflict. He'd always been skilled at framing conversations in ways that encouraged the outcomes he preferred, while making those outcomes seem like natural conclusions rather than predetermined objectives. They've both made some interesting suggestions, I said neutrally, curious to hear how David would present his version of the family's collective vision for my post-military future, though I got the impression these weren't spontaneous ideas they'd developed independently. You're right, we've discussed your situation as a family, not in any manipulative way, but out of genuine concern for your well-being and our relationships with each other. David leaned forward slightly, adopting the posture he typically used when presenting proposals to skeptical clients. Emma, when you left 4 years ago, you were angry and frustrated, convinced that choosing military service meant abandoning your family. We clearly failed to communicate that you could have both. That serving your country didn't require severing your connections to the people who care about you. The failure wasn't in communication, I replied. It was in the assumption that military service was somehow less valuable than working for Rodriguez commercial properties. Every conversation we had before I left made it clear that you viewed my decision as a waste of my potential rather than a legitimate career choice. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell I'd learned to recognize during childhood arguments about homework or curfews. Perhaps we didn't express our support as clearly as we should have, but you have to understand our perspective as well. We'd worked for 20 years to build something significant, something that could provide security and opportunity for our children. When you chose a completely different path, it felt like a rejection of everything we'd sacrificed to create those opportunities. Did it occur to you that I might want to create my own opportunities instead of inheriting yours? The question seemed to genuinely surprise him, as if the concept of building something independent from the family business was fundamentally foreign to his understanding of how success operated. Of course, building something independently has value, David said carefully. But starting from zero when you have access to established resources and relationships seems unnecessarily difficult. Rodriguez Commercial Properties represents 20 years of client development, regulatory expertise, and market positioning. Why abandon those advantages to begin again with nothing? My phone buzzed insistently against the table, and I glanced at the screen to see another call from Admiral Morrison's direct line. David noticed my attention shift and frowned, apparently interpreting my divided focus as evidence that I wasn't taking our conversation seriously. "Is that really necessary right now?" he asked, echoing the irritation that both Patricia and Rachel had expressed about my work responsibilities intruding on family time. "It might be," I said, declining the call but making a mental note to return it immediately after this conversation ended. My work doesn't operate on a convenient schedule, and some decisions can't wait for family events to conclude. "Your work," David repeated, with the same tone of careful consideration that Patricia had used earlier. "Emma, I've been researching what naval officers actually do, what the career progression looks like, what kind of life you can reasonably expect to build within the military structure, the salary limitations, the constant relocations, the restrictions on outside business activities. It's a constrained existence, especially for someone with your intelligence and potential." He was building toward something, I could tell. David never delivered casual observations, particularly not about topics he'd obviously researched thoroughly in preparation for this conversation. "Your current position, whatever the specific details might be, will eventually end. Military careers have defined endpoints, whether through retirement or the completion of service commitments. When that time comes, you'll need to transition to civilian life, and that transition will be much smoother if you have family connections and business relationships to build upon." "You've thought this through," I observed, recognizing the systematic approach David always used when analyzing complex problems or opportunities. He'd clearly spent considerable time developing a comprehensive understanding of military career limitations and civilian transition challenges. "I've thought it through because I care about your future, not just as a father, but as someone who understands how careers and financial security actually work in the real world." David leaned back slightly, apparently confident that his research had provided him with authoritative insights about my professional prospects. "The military provides structure and purpose, which are valuable, but it doesn't provide the kind of long-term wealth-building opportunities that allow people to achieve real independence and security. I almost smiled at his assessment of my financial limitations, considering that my current position involved making decisions that affected international commerce worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But David's understanding of military careers was apparently based on conventional assumptions about salary structures and advancement opportunities, rather than any awareness of the specialized roles that existed within defense contracting and maritime logistics coordination. What kind of opportunities are you envisioning? I asked, genuinely curious about how David proposed to integrate my military experience into the family business, without disrupting the established hierarchy that currently favored Tyler's position as heir apparent. Government contracting, David said immediately, apparently having anticipated this question. Rodriguez Commercial Properties has been evaluating expansion into federal projects, and your military background would provide credibility and connections that could be extremely valuable in that space. Defense Department construction contracts, infrastructure projects, facility management services for military installations. He was warming to his theme now, probably repeating elements of business plans he'd been developing since learning about my naval service. The federal contracting space represents billions of dollars in annual opportunities, but success requires understanding how government procurement actually works, knowing the right people, being able to navigate the regulatory requirements that intimidate most civilian contractors. And you think my experience would give Rodriguez Commercial Properties advantages in that market? I was beginning to understand the full scope of David's vision for my post-military integration into the family business, and it was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. I think your experience, combined with our existing capabilities and client relationships, could create a competitive advantage that would be very difficult for other firms to replicate. David was fully engaged now, speaking with the enthusiasm he typically reserved for discussing major business opportunities. Emma, we're not talking about a token position or charity employment. We're talking about creating a new division that leverages your unique qualifications to generate significant revenue and establish Rodriguez Commercial Properties as a major player in the federal contracting space. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message marked priority from Commander Chen. The message was brief but urgent, indicating that the Singapore operation required immediate authorization for a tactical adjustment that would affect shipping schedules across the Pacific. I quickly typed a response approving the recommended course of action, then returned my attention to David's presentation. That sounds like an interesting opportunity, I said diplomatically, not wanting to dismiss his proposal outright, while also not encouraging him to believe I was seriously considering it. Though I'd need to understand more about the timeline and specific responsibilities you have in mind. Obviously, you'd need to complete your current military commitment first, David replied immediately. I respect the importance of honoring contracts and fulfilling obligations. But after that, we could structure your entry into the company in whatever way makes the most sense for your career goals and our business objectives. He paused, apparently considering how much detail to provide about plans that were clearly still being developed. I've been consulting with attorneys who specialize in defense contracting to understand the regulatory requirements and competitive landscape. The opportunities are substantial, but success requires someone who understands both the military culture and the business realities of government procurement. Someone like me, I said, recognizing that David's research had led him to conclude that my military experience was potentially valuable in ways he hadn't initially appreciated when I first announced my intention to join the Navy. Someone exactly like you, David confirmed. Emma, I won't pretend that I understood the strategic value of your military service when you first made that decision. I was focused on the immediate disruption to our family plans, rather than the long-term capabilities you might develop. But I've had 4 years to research and think about this, and I now understand that your experience could be extraordinarily valuable in the right context. It was probably the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive from David, an acknowledgement that his initial opposition to my military service had been based on incomplete information rather than comprehensive analysis of the potential benefits. And the right context would be working for Rodriguez Commercial Properties? The right context would be building something significant that utilizes your talents while strengthening your family relationships and financial security. David's answer was carefully constructed to avoid making my participation seem like charity, while also emphasizing the benefits of choosing family connection over continued independence. My phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Admiral Morrison himself, rather than his staff. I looked at David apologetically, knowing that declining another call from the Admiral's direct line would create complications that extended far beyond family dinner conversations. "I need to take this," I said, answering on the third ring. "Admiral Morrison, this is Rodriguez," I said, automatically shifting to the professional tone I used for military communications. David watched with obvious curiosity, apparently trying to extract information about my current role and responsibilities from my side of the conversation. "Rodriguez, I need an immediate status update on the Pacific Corridor situation. The State Department is receiving inquiries from 3 different allied governments, and I need to brief the Joint Chiefs within the hour." Admiral Morrison's voice was characteristically direct, conveying both urgency and confidence that I would provide the information he needed quickly and accurately. "All operations are proceeding within normal parameters, sir. The Singapore adjustments have been implemented, and our Pacific Fleet coordination is maintaining optimal efficiency across all designated shipping lanes." I delivered the briefing concisely, aware that David was listening intently to every word despite having no context for understanding what the conversation actually involved. "Excellent. What about the October expansion timeline? Are we still on schedule for full implementation?" Admiral Morrison was asking about a project that would fundamentally reshape international maritime logistics and potentially influence global trade. Relationships worth trillions of dollars. Ahead of schedule, actually. We should have complete operational capability by September 20th, assuming no unexpected political developments in the region. I glanced at David, who was watching with an expression of growing confusion, as my conversation referenced operational timelines and international coordination that clearly extended far beyond anything he'd expected when he researched typical naval officer responsibilities. "Outstanding work, Rodriguez. The Pentagon is extremely pleased with your results, and there's already discussion about expanding your authority for the next phase of operations. We'll need a comprehensive briefing when you return from leave, but for now, continue enjoying your time with family." Admiral Morrison ended the call with his typical efficiency, leaving me alone again with David, who was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Emma," David said slowly, "what exactly do you do in the Navy?" His question was delivered with the careful tone of someone who was beginning to suspect that his understanding of a situation was significantly more limited than he'd previously assumed. "Maritime logistics coordination," I replied, which was technically accurate while revealing essentially nothing about the scope or significance of my actual responsibilities. David's research into typical naval careers had apparently not prepared him for the possibility that some military positions involved responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional service member duties. "Maritime logistics coordination," David repeated, as if testing the phrase for hidden meanings. "And that involves briefing admirals about Pacific Fleet operations and Pentagon authorization for international projects?" He was clearly trying to reconcile my conversation with Admiral Morrison with his assumptions about what naval officers typically did during their service commitments. "Sometimes," I said simply, not wanting to provide details that would complicate our conversation unnecessarily. David's offer to create a government contracting division at Rodriguez Commercial Properties was based on his understanding of my military experience as a credential that would provide credibility and connections in the federal marketplace. Explaining that my current position involved operational authority over international shipping coordinations worth hundreds of billions of dollars would probably overwhelm his ability to process the information productively. "Emma, I think I may have misunderstood the scope of your current responsibilities." David's admission was delivered with the careful precision of someone who prided himself on thorough research and comprehensive understanding of complex situations. When I researched naval careers, I was looking at conventional officer progression paths, not specialized positions that involve direct communication with Pentagon leadership about international operations. "It's a unique position," I acknowledged, which was certainly true even if it didn't capture the full extent of how unique my situation actually was. "Most naval officers follow more conventional career paths that fit the patterns you probably found in your research." David sat back in his chair, apparently recalibrating his understanding of my military service and its implications for his plans regarding my potential integration into Rodriguez's commercial properties. "This changes the conversation significantly," he said eventually. "If you're involved in high-level defense operations, then your transition to civilian life will involve considerations I hadn't anticipated." "What kind of considerations?" I was curious about how David's business-focused perspective would interpret the complexities of transitioning from specialized military roles to conventional civilian careers. Security clearances, non-disclosure agreements, restrictions on future employment that might conflict with your military experience. David was thinking through the implications as he spoke, probably drawing on whatever knowledge he had about defense contractors and their relationships with former military personnel. Companies that work in the defense space have to navigate complicated regulations about hiring former service members, especially those who held positions involving classified information or operational authority. Those are legitimate concerns, I agreed, though the specific regulations David was worried about were considerably more complex than he probably realized. My current position involved access to information and decision-making authority that would create permanent restrictions on certain types of civilian employment, though those restrictions were designed to prevent conflicts of interest rather than limit career opportunities entirely. "Emma, I want you to know that our offer stands regardless of these complications. If anything, your high-level military experience makes you even more valuable as a potential addition to Rodriguez's commercial properties." David was adapting his recruitment pitch in real time, apparently recognizing that my specialized background represented opportunities he hadn't previously considered. "But I also want you to know that we understand this decision is more complex than we initially realized. If you're involved in operations that affect international commerce and national security, then your transition timeline and options may be different from what we originally discussed." David's acknowledgement of complexity was probably the most sophisticated response I'd received from any family member today, suggesting that he was genuinely trying to understand my situation rather than simply recruiting me for predetermined roles. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from the Seattle Operations Center, indicating that our Pacific coordination systems were functioning at optimal efficiency and that the October expansion project remained ahead of schedule. I glanced at the message briefly, then looked back at David, who was watching with obvious fascination. "Dad, I appreciate the offer, and I appreciate that you've put serious thought into how my military experience might benefit Rodriguez's commercial properties." I chose my words carefully, wanting to acknowledge his effort while also preparing him for a response he probably wasn't expecting. "But I need you to understand that my current position isn't just a temporary assignment that I'm planning to leave when my military commitment ends." David's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that he was beginning to recognize that this conversation wasn't proceeding according to his expectations. "What do you mean exactly?" "I mean that what I'm doing now isn't just military service in the conventional sense. It's a career that I've built intentionally, with responsibilities and opportunities that extend far beyond anything Rodriguez commercial properties could offer, regardless of how well-intentioned the government contracting division might be." I watched David's face as he processed this information, recognizing the moment when he realized that his carefully constructed recruitment plan was based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about my career goals and professional capabilities. "Emma, are you saying that you don't plan to return to civilian life after your military service ends?" David's question revealed the core assumption that had shaped all of our family's discussions about my future, the belief that military service was inherently temporary, and that eventually I would need to transition to what they considered a real career in the civilian world. "I'm saying that the distinction between military and civilian careers isn't as clear-cut as you might think, especially in specialized fields that involve international coordination and strategic planning." I was trying to help David understand that my current position represented career advancement rather than temporary service, though I suspected that his business-focused worldview would make this concept difficult to process. The break room door opened suddenly, and Tyler entered with the expression of someone who had been searching for our father and was relieved to have finally located him. "Dad, the Wellingtons are asking about the Desert Mesa project timeline, and Marcus wants to know if you finalized the partnership agreement for the Sonoma development. They're expecting specific updates, and I can't answer their questions without more details." Tyler glanced at me briefly, apparently surprised to find that David's conversation with his youngest daughter was still ongoing, then focused his attention back on our father. Also, Mom wants to know if you're planning to give a toast during dinner service, because the coordinator needs to adjust the schedule if you're going to speak. David stood up slowly, clearly torn between his business responsibilities to the wedding celebration and his desire to continue our conversation about my career plans and his misunderstood assumptions about my future intentions. Tell the Wellingtons I'll join them in 10 minutes and let your mother know that I'll keep any toast brief so it doesn't interfere with the dinner schedule. Tyler nodded and left quickly, apparently eager to avoid being drawn into whatever family discussion was taking place in the catering break room. David looked back at me with obvious reluctance, recognizing that our conversation was being interrupted at a crucial moment when he was just beginning to understand that his entire framework for thinking about my situation needed to be reconsidered. Emma, we need to continue this conversation, but I have obligations to Rachel and the wedding guests that I can't postpone. David moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. But I want you to know that everything you've told me today has changed my understanding of your career and your future prospects. We clearly need to have a much more comprehensive discussion about what you're actually doing and what opportunities might exist for collaboration rather than employment. I'd be open to that conversation, I said, which was true even though I suspected that David's business-oriented perspective would continue to limit his ability to fully understand the scope and significance of my current responsibilities. Though it might be helpful if you research defense logistics and maritime coordination rather than conventional military careers before we talk again. David nodded thoughtfully, apparently recognizing that his preparation for today's recruitment conversation had been based on incomplete and inaccurate information about what my military service actually involved. I'll do that research, and I'll approach our next conversation with fewer assumptions about what you want or need from your family relationships. After David left, I sat alone in the break room for several minutes, processing the various recruitment attempts I'd received throughout the day, and recognizing the common theme underlying all of them. My family wanted me back, but only within frameworks they could understand and control, only in ways that enhanced their existing narrative about success and belonging, rather than challenging their fundamental assumptions about what valuable careers looked like. My phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Commander Chen rather than Admiral Morrison's office. Commander, this is Rodriguez, I answered, grateful for the excuse to focus on clear, concrete problems rather than the emotional complexity of family relationships that seemed to resist all attempts at rational analysis. Rodriguez, we've got developments in the Singapore situation that require immediate attention. 3 allied governments are requesting expanded coordination protocols, and the Pacific Fleet is asking for additional operational authority to implement the October expansion ahead of schedule. Commander Chen's voice was crisp and professional, conveying information that would affect international trade relationships and military coordination across multiple time zones. What's the specific timeline they're requesting? I asked, automatically shifting back into the analytical mode that my current position required. Outside the break room window, I could see wedding guests beginning to move toward the main dining area for the formal dinner service, all of them focused on celebration and social interaction, rather than the kind of strategic decision-making that occupied most of my professional attention. Full implementation by September 15th, with provisional authority for tactical adjustments based on real-time shipping data and political developments in the region. Commander Chen was describing a project that would fundamentally alter how international maritime logistics operated across the Pacific, affecting everything from commercial shipping schedules to military deployment capabilities. Approved, I said immediately, recognizing that the accelerated timeline would actually simplify several coordination challenges we'd been anticipating for the October launch. Send the authorization through normal channels, and let Admiral Morrison know that we're confident about meeting the new deadline without compromising operational security or efficiency. Will do. Also, the Pentagon is asking about your availability for a briefing next week. They're apparently getting questions from congressional leadership about the scope and implications of the Pacific Coordination Project. Commander Chen was referring to the kind of high-level political attention that typically accompanied projects with significant economic and strategic implications. Schedule it for Wednesday morning, I replied, checking my calendar mentally to ensure that the timing wouldn't conflict with other obligations. And send me background materials on whatever specific concerns Congress is raising so I can prepare appropriately detailed responses. After ending the call with Commander Chen, I returned my attention to the sounds of the wedding celebration continuing beyond the break room walls. The band had shifted to dinner music, something elegant and understated that would provide atmosphere without interfering with conversation between courses. Through the window, I could see catering staff moving efficiently between the kitchen and the main dining area, executing the carefully choreographed service that would ensure Rachel's wedding reception proceeded exactly according to plan. I stood up and stretched, recognizing that my day of family conversations and recruitment attempts was probably approaching its conclusion. Rachel would expect me to stay through dinner out of basic courtesy, but after that I could reasonably make my excuses and return to my hotel without seeming deliberately antisocial. The various offers I'd received from Tyler, Patricia, Rachel, and David all reflected genuine concern for my future, combined with fundamental misunderstandings about what that future actually looked like. My phone buzzed with one final message, this time from Admiral Morrison himself rather than his staff. The message was brief but significant, indicating that the Pacific Coordination Project had received final approval from the Secretary of Defense, and that my operational authority would be expanded to include additional international partners and shipping corridors. It was the kind of professional advancement that David's research into conventional naval careers had never anticipated, the kind of opportunity that made civilian job offers seem quaint rather than compelling. I gathered my things and prepared to rejoin the wedding celebration for dinner service, knowing that my family's attempts to recruit me back into their version of success would continue, but also knowing that those attempts were based on assumptions about my career limitations that were no longer accurate. They wanted to help me transition from what they viewed as temporary military service to what they considered a real career in the civilian world, never suspecting that I'd already built something more significant than anything Rodriguez Commercial Properties could offer. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's exclusion from my life had actually created the space necessary for me to develop capabilities and responsibilities that exceeded anything they could have provided through inherited opportunities and family connections. Their attempt to manage my career path by limiting my options had inadvertently freed me to pursue possibilities they couldn't even conceptualize, much less control or direct. As I prepared to leave the break room and rejoin the wedding reception, I reflected on the strange dynamics that had shaped this day. My family had invited me back into their lives, but only within carefully defined parameters. Only in ways that confirmed their existing beliefs about success and belonging, rather than challenging their assumptions about what valuable careers actually looked like. They offered me inclusion at the price of accepting their framework for understanding my worth and potential, never recognizing that I'd already moved beyond the need for their approval or their opportunities. The wedding celebration would continue according to plan, a carefully orchestrated demonstration of family success and social prominence that would be photographed extensively and shared across various media platforms to maintain the Rodriguez family's reputation in wine country society. Rachel would have her perfect day, Tyler would continue managing his inherited commercial real estate clients, and David and Patricia would maintain their positions as respected business leaders in the Napa Valley community. And I would return to coordinating international maritime operations that affected global commerce worth hundreds of billions of dollars, making decisions that influenced relationships between allied governments, managing responsibilities that extended far beyond anything my family could understand or control. They had offered me a seat at their table, but I had already built my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.